Right now, Miami is one of the wealthiest, most photographed, most desired cities on the face of the earth. 6 million people live in its metropolitan sprawl. Lamborghinis idle at red lights next to food trucks selling plantains. The skyline punches into the sky like a fever dream. Glass towers, neon, salt air, and the constant low roar of a city that never quite sleeps. Forbes calls it the most international city in America. Real estate here sells for $3,000 per square foot. But here is the thing nobody tells you. Less than 200 years ago, not in ancient history, not in some misty medieval past, less than 200 years ago, this entire glittering metropolis was an uninhabitable fever swamp. No roads, no people, no future, just mosquitoes the size of thumbnails, alligators in black water, and a jungle so dense and hostile that the US Army once called it the most miserable terrain on the North American continent. How does a malarial swamp become one of the great cities of the world in under 2 centuries? That story, violent, visionary, tragic, and completely insane, starts not 200 years ago. It starts 10,000 years ago. It is 10,000 BCE. The sea level is 300 feet lower than it is today. You are standing on a vast limestone plateau, bone dry and windswept, where the Atlantic Ocean will one day swallow the ground beneath your feet. Massive megafauna roam what is now downtown Miami. Mastodons, giant ground sloths, camels. Yes, camels in Florida. The peninsula is twice as wide as it is today, stretching far out into what will become the Gulf of Mexico. Then the ice melts, the seas rise, the continent reshapes itself, and the people who survive this transformation, slowly, over thousands of years, become the Tequesta. By the time Europeans first glimpse this coastline, the Tequesta have been here for at least 2,000 years. They build no pyramids. They raise no monuments the Spanish would recognize, but they are deeply, profoundly sophisticated in ways that still astonish archaeologists today. They live at the mouth of the Miami River, one of the shortest rivers in North America, just 5.5 miles long, and they read the sea the way a scholar reads a book. They fish with nets woven from palm fiber. They navigate the Florida reef system in dugout canoes without charts or compasses. They trade with cultures hundreds of miles away. And then, in 1896, a construction crew building a hotel in downtown Miami digs into the limestone and hits something extraordinary. Carved into the bedrock of the river mouth, a perfect circle, 38 feet in diameter, lined with holes that align precisely with the rising sun during the summer solstice and equinoxes. They call it the Miami Circle. It is at least 2,000 years old. Scientists cannot fully explain how it was made or why. It costs the city $26.7 million to preserve it in place. It sits today, invisible under a park, in the shadow of a luxury condominium tower. The Tequesta built something meant to last forever. They had no idea how right they were. Here is what the Spanish bring when they arrive in 1513. Horses, steel, and disease. Juan Ponce de Leon sails past this coastline in April 1513. He does not stop. He does not linger. He is looking for gold he will never find. But the germs traveling with his fleet don't need permission to go ashore. Within decades, epidemic waves of smallpox, measles, and influenza begin tearing through Tequesta villages. A people who numbered in the thousands when the Spanish arrived are reduced to fewer than 100 by the 1700s. The last known Tequesta abandoned Florida in 1763, boarding Spanish ships in St. Augustine and sailing to Cuba, exiles from a homeland their ancestors had held for 10 millennia. They leave behind a circle in the rock and almost nothing else. For 3 full centuries, Miami is essentially a footnote. The Spanish claim Florida, but barely bother with its southern tip. The terrain defeats them every time. It is hot in a way that feels personal, not just warm air, but a wet, pressing biological heat that soaks through clothing in minutes and turns every cut into an infection. The mosquitoes breed in standing water so thick that early settlers describe clouds of them blackening the sky at dusk. The Everglades, 1.5 million acres of sawgrass, cypress swamp, and shallow water form an almost impenetrable barrier to the interior. So Spain ignores Miami. Britain takes Florida briefly, 1763 to 1783, ignores Miami. Spain takes it back, ignores Miami again. In 1821, the United States buys Florida from Spain for $5 million, roughly $130 million in today's money, and promptly discovers that the Seminole people who had migrated south from Georgia and Alabama have no intention of leaving. What follows is one of the darkest and least discussed chapters in American military history. The Second Seminole War, beginning in 1835, becomes the longest, costliest, and bloodiest Indian war in American history. 7 years, 1,500 American soldiers dead, $40 million spent, roughly $1.3 billion today. And the US Army still cannot defeat the Seminoles. The swamps are the Seminoles' greatest weapon. Osceola, their most brilliant military commander, never loses a battle in open engagement. He is finally captured in 1837, not in combat, but under a flag of truce, a betrayal so widely condemned that even American newspapers call it a disgrace. To fight in this war, the Army builds a series of forts along the coast of South Florida. One of them, Fort Dallas, is constructed in 1836 on the north bank of the Miami River. It is the first permanent American structure in what will become the city of Miami. Nobody there yet thinks it will become a city. Nobody thinks anything will grow here at all. It is 1895. Julia Tuttle is a widow from Cleveland, Ohio, who has staked everything she owns on a fever swamp at the bottom of Florida. She bought 640 acres on the north bank of the Miami River in 1891. For reasons her friends in Cleveland considered evidence of madness. She's been trying for 4 years to convince railroad magnate Henry Flagler, the man who built the Florida East Coast Railway, the man who essentially invented the concept of Florida tourism, to extend his railroad south to Miami. Flagler has said no multiple times. He sees no reason to lay track through mosquito-infested wilderness for a population of fewer than 300 people. Then, in February 1895, the Great Freeze hits Florida. Temperatures across the state plunge so low that virtually every orange and lemon tree from Jacksonville to Palm Beach is destroyed overnight. Florida's agricultural economy collapses, but something extraordinary happens at the bottom of the peninsula. Miami's location, protected by the Gulf Stream and buffered by Biscayne Bay, means the freeze barely touches it. Julia Tuttle walks into her garden the morning after the freeze and finds her orange blossoms blooming. She picks a small bouquet, wraps it in damp cotton, and sends it by messenger to Henry Flagler in St. Augustine. Fresh orange blossoms in February after a statewide freeze. Flagler gets on his private train within days. By the time he arrives in Miami and sees Biscayne Bay for the first time, he reportedly says, "This is indeed a magic place." He agrees to extend the railroad. In exchange, Tuttle gives him half her land. The railroad reaches Miami on April 15, 1896. 3 months later, on July 28, 1896, Miami is officially incorporated as a city. Population 344. What happens next is almost hallucinogenic in its speed. Within a decade, Miami has paved streets, a post office, a newspaper, and hotels filling with tourists who have never seen anything like the turquoise water of Biscayne Bay. Henry Flagler builds the Royal Palm Hotel, Miami's first luxury accommodation, at a cost of $175,000, a staggering investment for 1897. He then keeps going south, extending his railroad across open ocean on a series of bridges and causeways all the way to Key West, a feat of engineering so audacious that when the Overseas Railroad opened in 1912, the world called it the eighth wonder of the modern world. Miami is no longer a footnote. Miami is becoming a destination, but the city's darkest hour is hiding just below the glittering surface. AR-04, boom, bust, and hurricane, 1920 to 1945. The 1920s land boom in Miami is one of the greatest speculative frenzies in American history, and almost nobody remembers it. By 1923, Miami real estate has become a national obsession. Land that sold for hundreds of dollars an acre in 1910 is selling for hundreds of thousands in 1924. Binder boys, mostly young men in linen suits, work the streets of Miami and the train platforms, selling contracts on land they've never seen to buyers who never intend to visit. At the peak of the madness in 1925, an estimated 75,000 people are making a living purely from real estate speculation in a city of 100,000 residents. The Miami Herald becomes the heaviest newspaper in America, not from news, but from real estate advertising. One single Sunday edition weighs 7.5 pounds. George Merrick is building Coral Gables from scratch, a planned Mediterranean city of fountains, plazas, and bougainvillea conceived entirely in his own mind and bulldozed into existence through sheer will. Carl Fisher is filling in mangroves on a sandbar west of Miami Beach and creating, essentially from nothing, one of the most famous resort strips on Earth. Then, at 7:30 a.m. on September 18th, 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane makes landfall. Winds of 150 miles per hour. Storms surge 15 feet high. The eye passes directly over downtown Miami. A wall of water moving at the speed of a freight train pushes through Coconut Grove, Moore Haven, and the beaches. 373 people die officially. Historians believe the real number is far higher, with hundreds of migrant workers buried in mass graves and never counted. 43,000 people are left homeless in a single morning. Property damage reaches $1 billion in 1926 dollars. The boom does not merely slow, it collapses. Banks foreclose. Developers vanish. The binder boys go home. Miami's brief reign as America's hottest real estate market ends in a single September morning, 3 full years before the Great Depression hits the rest of the country. Miami bleeds through the Depression and barely notices World War II at first, until the military discovers that South Florida's climate makes it perfect for training. Over 1 million soldiers pass through Miami area facilities between 1941 and 1945. The Roni Plaza Hotel on Miami Beach becomes a barracks. The golf courses become drill fields. The soldiers who survive go home. And then, inexplicably, irresistibly, they come back. Returning veterans remember the warmth, the water, the sheer pleasure of Florida, and they want it permanently. The GI Bill makes it possible. Air conditioning, commercially available for the first time in affordable home units by the early 1950s, makes it bearable. For the first time in history, a subtropical climate is no longer a survival challenge. It is a selling point. Nothing in Miami's history will prepare it for what happens next. The post-war boom transforms Miami in ways even Julia Tuttle couldn't have imagined. By 1950, Miami's population has hit 249,000. By 1960, the broader metro area holds over 1 million people. Miami Beach, a barrier island that didn't exist in any useful sense before Carl Fisher built it, becomes the winter capital of America's entertainment industry. The Fontainebleau Hotel, opened in 1954, is so outrageously, defiantly glamorous that it basically defines the word Miami for an entire generation. Frank Sinatra films there. Elvis performs there. The Rat Pack owns the place on weekends. But Miami in the 1950s has a wound at its center. The Overtown neighborhood, just northwest of downtown, is home to Miami's black community, compressed into 20 square blocks by rigid, violently enforced segregation. African-American performers who sell out the Fontainebleau cannot eat in its restaurant, cannot sleep in its rooms. Nat King Cole, Sammy Davis Jr., Josephine Baker, all of them finish their shows and drive back to Overtown, to the Mary Elizabeth Hotel, the only establishment that will take them. They call Overtown the Harlem of the South. In its prime, it pulses with jazz clubs, restaurants, and a self-contained economy built by and for people the rest of Miami refuses to see. Then comes the highway. Interstate 95, planned by engineers in Washington who have never set foot in Overtown, is routed directly through the neighborhood's heart, not because it was the most logical route, but because demolishing poor black neighborhoods cost less in political capital than displacing white ones. By 1970, Overtown is cut in two. 40,000 residents are displaced. The jazz clubs are gone. The restaurants are gone. The Mary Elizabeth Hotel is gone. A community that survived segregation does not survive the interstate. And then, on April 17, 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles land on a beach called Playa Girón in southern Cuba. The CIA-backed Bay of Pigs invasion fails completely in 72 hours. The men are captured. John F. Kennedy is humiliated on the world stage, and 1,400 families in Miami, already home to the first wave of Cuban exiles fleeing Fidel Castro, wait for news that does not come. Miami will never be the same city again. The city's identity is about to shatter and rebuild itself into something the world has never seen. Music, Cuban sun, bittersweet, layered under narration. Between 1959 and 1980, over 600,000 Cuban exiles arrive in Miami. They come in waves. First the wealthy professionals and landowners fleeing Castro's revolution, then the working class. Then, in 1980, the Mariel boat lift, 125,000 Cubans in 6 months, including, as Fidel Castro deliberately included, thousands of prisoners and psychiatric patients released directly from Cuban institutions. The transformation of Miami is total and permanent. Little Havana, the neighborhood along Southwest 8th Street, known locally as Calle Ocho, becomes a city within a city. Spanish becomes the first language of commerce. The smell of Café Cubano, dense, sweet espresso cut with sugar, seeps into every corner of the neighborhood. Domino players in Maximo Gomez Park argue in rapid-fire Cuban Spanish about baseball, politics, and Castro, who they are absolutely certain will fall any day now. 40 years later, some of them are still waiting. The Cuban community does something that immigrant communities in American cities rarely do. They don't assimilate into Miami. They reshape it. By 1980, Miami has the highest percentage of foreign-born residents of any major American city. 3 of its major TV stations broadcast in Spanish. Its most powerful business and civic leaders are Cuban. A new hybrid culture, Cuban-American, neither fully Cuban nor fully American, plants its flag and calls the ground beneath it home. But 1980 is also the year Miami nearly destroys itself. In May 1980, 4 Dade County police officers are acquitted in the beating death of Arthur McDuffie, a black insurance salesman who died after being beaten for 8 minutes during a traffic stop, while officers used their radios to drown out his screams. The verdict ignites 3 days of riots, the deadliest racial violence in America since the 1960s. 18 people are killed, 350 are injured, $100 million in property is destroyed. The National Guard occupies the streets. And then, between 1978 and 1985, the cocaine trade arrives with the force of a second hurricane. At its peak, Miami handles an estimated 70 to 80% of all cocaine entering the United States. The Medellin cartel uses Miami as its primary American distribution hub. Bodies turn up in car trunks. Colombian hitmen operate with near impunity. The Miami Metro Dade police are so outgunned that they beg the federal government for help. The Dadeland Mall massacre of 1979, a noon-hour shooting in a liquor store that sends shoppers diving behind cars in the parking lot, while gunmen with submachine guns continue firing, introduces suburban America to a new word, cartel. The violence is so bad, so visible, so cinematic, that a TV producer named Michael Mann turns it into a television show. Miami Vice premieres in 1984. Don Johnson in a white suit, Ferrari Testarossa, pastel skyline. The show is meant to be a crime drama. It accidentally becomes Miami's greatest tourism advertisement. The city's Art Deco hotels, crumbling and forgotten since the 1950s, suddenly look impossibly cool on television. Developers take notice. The most unlikely resurrection in American urban history is about to begin. Miami, in 1990, is a city that smells of gunpowder and possibility in roughly equal measure. The cocaine wars are winding down, not because the drugs stop flowing, but because the Medellin cartel's leadership is being systematically hunted and killed by Colombian security forces and the DEA. Pablo Escobar will die in Medellin in December 1993. The worst of the violence drains away. What fills the vacuum is money, and this time, The money comes from everywhere on Earth simultaneously. The Art Deco historic district of South Beach, championed throughout the 1980s by a preservation activist named Barbara Bayer Capitman, who fought city officials determined to demolish it for parking lots, is now the most photographed streetscape in America. Calvin Klein shoots campaigns here. Gianni Versace buys a mansion at 1116 Ocean Drive in 1992. Fashion Week descends every year. The Delano Hotel reopens in 1995 and single-handedly invents a new aesthetic, pure white, surrealist, effortlessly strange, that becomes the visual language of luxury hospitality worldwide. Then, Hurricane Andrew hits on August 24th, 1992. 165-mile-per-hour winds, the most destructive hurricane in American history to that point. Homestead, 25 miles south of Miami, is effectively erased from the map. 175,000 people are left homeless. $27 billion in damage. The storm reveals something shocking. Tens of thousands of homes built in the 1980s, were constructed with fraudulent inspections, substandard materials, and missing bolts. Roofs fly off as complete units because they were never properly attached. Miami rebuilds, stricter, stronger, angrier, throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Waves of immigrants from Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, Brazil, and Haiti layer new identities onto the city. Miami becomes the financial capital of Latin America, not by design, but by geography, by language, and by the particular entrepreneurial hunger that immigrants carry with them across borders. The port of Miami becomes the busiest cruise port on Earth. Miami International Airport handles more international passengers than any US airport outside JFK. And then, in the 2000s and 2010s, Miami does something truly unprecedented. It invents a world-class contemporary art scene from nothing. Art Basel Miami Beach, an offshoot of the famous Swiss art fair that launched in 2002, transforms Miami into a global art capital every December, drawing 80,000 collectors, curators, and artists from 90 countries, and generating over $500 million for the local economy in a single week. But beneath all of it, beneath the art and the wealth and the reinvention, the sea is rising. Miami sits on porous limestone. Unlike New York or London, it cannot simply build a seawall. Water rises through the rock from below. At high tide today, streets in Miami Beach already flood with no rain at all. Scientists project that by 2100, without radical intervention, much of what we call Miami will be underwater. The city is spending billions on pump stations, raised roads, and seawall projects. It is the most ambitious climate adaptation effort in American municipal history. A city built on a swamp is now fighting to keep the swamp from reclaiming it. Miami is a city that should not exist. Every force of nature, geography, and reason argued against it. The swamps said no. The hurricanes said no. The mosquitoes, the floods, the heat, the limestone, the sea, all of it said no. And yet, here it stands, improbable, infuriating, gorgeous, resilient, a city built by a widow with orange blossoms, carved out by railroad men and Cuban exiles and Haitian artists and Colombian entrepreneurs and 1,000 other people who refused to accept what the map told them was possible. A city where the Miami Circle, 2,000 years old, hidden under a park, surrounded by glass towers, still sits in the bedrock like a whispered message from people who understood something about this place that we are only beginning to remember. Miami doesn't have a history so much as it has a will. A stubborn, irrational, magnificent will to become something. That story isn't over, not even close. If this took you somewhere you didn't expect to go, drop a comment below and tell me which era hit you hardest. And if you want more stories like this, cities, civilizations, and the insane humans who built them, subscribe. Every single video I make, I try to leave you knowing something that changes how you see the world. See you in the next one.